On this episode of Classic Gaming Quarterly, we take a look at the Sega Genesis as it finishes out 1989, its first calendar year on the market here in North America. As we've discussed on previous episodes, the 16-bit generation was officially kicked off by the near-simultaneous launch of both the Genesis and TurboGrafx-16 in the late summer of 1989. While we're all now familiar with the relative success of the two systems, at the time the choice between the two was far from obvious, and the games being released post-launch for each would play a key role in the decision-making process of gamers looking to upgrade. So now let's take a look at the Genesis side of the equation, and the post-launch games being released for it up through its first holiday season. The Genesis and TurboGrafx-16 both saw a limited release in August of 1989, with a national rollout complete by the following month. The TurboGrafx had a strong launch lineup, highlighted by Dungeon Explorer and Blazing Lasers, and NEC had more brand recognition with consumers. The Genesis had a solid launch lineup of its own, including Space Harrier 2, Tommy Lasorda Baseball, and the outstanding Thunder Force 2. But Sega was going to have to continue to bring out quality titles in the following months if they were to establish a real presence in the American market. The first two post-launch releases for the Genesis came out sometime in either very late September or first thing in October. The first game, World Championship Soccer, is a fairly forgettable sports title that certainly didn't live up to the standard set by Tommy Lasorda Baseball, although the games do look similar with the overhead view and similarly styled player sprites. You can choose between a simple 1 or 2 player single game, or play for the World Championship, which as you might have guessed is a tournament mode. The game isn't horrible or anything, but it's hard to know who you're passing the ball to, and much like real soccer, it's hard to generate any offense. Still, if you were a big soccer fan looking for a new game to play in the fall of '89, I would think you'd be relatively happy with this one. That being said, I don't really find this game particularly interesting to play now, so let's move on to the next game, which is infinitely more noteworthy. Ghouls and Ghosts was a 1988 Capcom arcade game and was the sequel to 1985's Ghosts and Goblins. The game ran on Capcom CPS hardware, the same platform that was home to Final Fight, Strider, and the first few iterations of Street Fighter II. The Genesis version of Ghouls and Ghosts was actually programmed from scratch by Yuji Naka, who would of course go on to fame as the head of Sonic Team and the creator of that legendary franchise. The game was also released for the Sega Master System, and in my opinion is a pretty impressive port, all things considered. In Ghouls and Ghosts, you take on the role of Sir Arthur. Unfortunately, the home version of the game cuts out the intro sequence that sets up the plot, but as you may have guessed, it has something to do with a kidnapped girlfriend. Save her by battling through 5 levels of zombies and other spooky denizens. Arthur dons a suit of armor, which can be upgraded by picking up a power-up, but can also be lost, leaving him cruising around in his chonies if you get hit. Get hit again while he's rocking the tighty-whities, and it's curtains. The same chests that pop up and give you a new weapon or armor upgrade also frequently contain an evil magician. This clown temporarily turns you into either a geriatric version of yourself who moves much more slowly, but can at least still attack enemies, or this completely useless and inexplicable duck wearing a bow tie. The graphics are excellent and really show off the ability of the Genesis to bring the arcade experience home. I'm also a huge fan of the soundtrack, and have been known to turn the game on while busy doing something else, just to hear it running in the background. If you're feeling bored, you can input a code in the options menu that will load the Japanese version of the game, but everything is exactly the same, except that during the cutscene at the end of the 5th level, the text will be in Japanese instead of English. Maybe this is just as well, because what you're being told is that you have to play through the entire game a second time to actually beat it. While this seems like a bum deal, you're almost immediately given a new weapon, which is required to beat the final boss, and is easily the most powerful weapon in the game. This time, once you get to the end of Stage 5, you face one final boss before rescuing Princess Prin Prin. Ghouls and Ghosts is well known for being extremely challenging, due in part to its unforgiving controls, but much like Castlevania, the game is quite beatable with practice. Some people seem to get really hung up on the fact that this game isn't arcade perfect, and point to the Super Graphics version as the best home release. While this might be true, the Genesis version of the game is an excellent port, and was the first of several Capcom arcade hits that would come to the Genesis early in its lifespan. October likely saw the release of 3 new games on the Genesis. The first, Arnold Palmer Tournament Golf, was the third sports title released for a console that would become known for the genre. Sega paid for a celebrity endorsement for this game in both the East and West, as the game was released in Japan as Naomichi Ozaki Supermasters, Ozaki being a famous Japanese golfer who played in both the PGA and Japan Golf Tour. In both cases, the celebrity endorser does not make an appearance in the game, their presence being limited to their image festooning the game's cover art. I've never really been a fan of golf, either playing it at my local course or watching it on TV, but for some reason I really like golf video games. Maybe it's the simplicity paired with the instant feedback system that keeps me chasing that perfect shot. Arnold Palmer Tournament Golf allows you to play 1 or 2 player one-off rounds, but also has a tournament mode complete with a password-based save system. Speaking of which, could this password be any longer? In this mode, your player's skill will increase, he'll earn money allowing him to upgrade his clubs, and he gets better advice from his caddy. There are a couple of Easter eggs in this game that make reference to other Sega franchises. Alex Kidd makes an appearance at the halfway point of your round, and Opa Opa from Fantasy Zone stands in as the cursor on the in-game options screen. You can also unlock a playable level from Fantasy Zone in this game by hitting 100 shots on a single hole. The obvious comparison to be made here, in my opinion, is between Arnold Palmer Tournament Golf and Power Golf on the TurboGrafx 16. The games were released within about a month of one another, and were the first 2 golf games of the 16-bit generation. Arnold Palmer features humongous detailed sprites, the choice of several different music tracks or no music at all, much better control, and 3 different 18-hole courses, making the game clearly superior to Power Golf. While the game would be made obsolete by EA's PGA Tour Golf series, it's an underappreciated gem from the early days of the Genesis that deserves a look if you have even a passing interest in the genre. Rambo III was developed by Sega for release on both the Genesis and Master System, although the 2 games are completely different, and is based on the movie of the same name which was released the previous year. Taking place during the Soviet war in Afghanistan, you take control of former Green Beret John Rambo, who is sent on a vigilante mission by Red Foreman to save Rambo's surrogate father and former unit commander Colonel Sam Troutman, who has been kidnapped by the Soviets. The game is a run-and-gun style shooter in the same vein as Capcom's Mercs or SNK's Shock Troopers. Presented in a third-person isometric overhead view, mission objectives range from just making it to the end of the level, to rescuing possible secret agents, to blowing up their weapons cache, and apparently their stockpile of Sega supplies. I guess to lower morale? Rambo's primary weapon is his machine gun, which has unlimited ammo. He also carries both the knife and bow with explosive arrows that he's known for, as well as timed bombs, but the latter 2 both have limited use and additional ammo for them must be picked up. Overall, the music in Rambo 3 is boring and unnoteworthy, but the sound effects are pretty sweet. The graphics look good for an early Genesis title, but are nothing to write home about. The sprites are tiny and therefore lack detail, but that's hard to avoid in a run-and-gun game like this, as you want to be zoomed out as much as possible. The game also suffers from some pretty bad slowdown if you get too large a cadre of enemies following you around the screen, but this really doesn't happen very often. It would be awesome if this game had a 2-player co-op mode, but that wouldn't jive with the lone wolf Rambo plot. The game has a 2-player mode, but it's non-simultaneous, and the second player doesn't get to play until player 1 either finishes a level or gets a game over and chooses not to continue. Much like Ghouls and Ghosts, Rambo 3 would have been a must-buy for me back in the day. There's more than enough gameplay here to keep you occupied for quite some time, especially if you can resist the urge to keep hitting continue until you beat the game. Developed by Sega AM2 and designed by the man Yu Suzuki, Super Hang-On was a 1987 arcade hit and the follow-up to 1985's Hang-On. The game is basically the MotoGP analog to Super Monaco GP and has you racing motorcycles instead of Grand Prix cars. Anyone who spent time in the arcades in the 1980s will surely remember these games, as the deluxe version of the original had a motorcycle chassis that you sat on with the monitor built into the dashboard. Super Hang-On has 2 game modes to choose from at startup. The arcade mode is exactly what it sounds like, while original mode, oddly named since in reality the arcade mode is the original mode, makes up the real meat and potatoes of the game. This plays like a career mode and has you racing rivals to earn money with which you can repair and upgrade your bike. When you start playing the game, your motorcycle is going to feel really slow compared to what you have in arcade mode, which I find frustrating. But original mode is what turns Super Hang-On into a game that you can really sink your teeth into, rather than just a pick up and play arcade racer that's good for a few minutes of fun here and there. That being said, I generally play Super Hang-On when I just want a few minutes of fun here and there. This isn't 1989 anymore, so when I want to sink my teeth into a career-based racing game, it's going to be Gran Turismo 6. Thankfully, the arcade mode in this game is awesome. You have 4 difficulty levels to choose from, each based in a different part of the world. The control takes some getting used to, but once you've spent some time with the game, it handles just fine. Get your bike up to 280 kilometers per hour, and you can use a special turbo boost to give you an extra burst of speed, which you'll need if you want to beat the clock at each checkpoint and keep your game going. The graphics in this game are extremely colorful, and much like Space Harrier 2, are an excellent example of Sega taking advantage of the abilities of the Genesis without trying to do too much with too little. Just like Outrun, Super Hang-On lets you choose a musical track to listen to before you start your game. They all sound great, so I just try to switch it up with each game played. While the arcade mode is the real selling point for me now, the career mode would have been huge for me back in the day, making this a game that I definitely would have wanted to buy. Forgotten Worlds was the second Capcom arcade game to be ported to the Genesis, and like Ghouls and Ghosts was also originally a 1988 CPS release. In fact, Forgotten Worlds holds the distinction of being the very first game released on the CPS platform. The game is a horizontal shooter in which a couple of ripped dudes wearing Oakley blades have to save Earth from an evil god named Bios and his 8 yes men who appear as bosses at the end of each level. In the arcade, the game had a special button that could be both pushed and rotated. Turning the button rotated your character, while pressing it acted as the fire button. Obviously, this was not possible on the Genesis, so in this port the B button fires your weapon, while A and C rotate your character one way or the other. This can be a bit awkward while holding the controller in the traditional manner, since you really want to be able to press more than one button at the same time. You can either turn your right hand over, allowing you to use your fingers on the buttons instead of your thumb, or bust out an arcade stick, which is what I did when recording this footage. Reminiscent of Sega's own Fantasy Zone, in Forgotten Worlds you can pick up coins dropped by vanquished enemies, and then use that money to buy supplies in a shop that pops up once in each level. Available items include weapon upgrades, health restoration, maximum health increases, and information on how to beat that level's boss. The shop in each level sells 2 weapon upgrades, and one of those 2 will generally make it much easier to defeat that end-level boss. Audio-visually, Forgotten Worlds is pretty average for an early Genesis game. The graphics are decent with some interesting detail and variety in the stages, the music is okay but doesn't stand out, and the sound effects are actually kind of crappy. All that being said, the game is fun to play once you get used to the controls, and that's what's really important. Forgotten Worlds is a very tough game, and the fact that it does not offer you the option to continue your game makes it that much harder. Still, the game is quite satisfying to play, and the fact that you have to start over from scratch each time just means you'll have to put that much more time in before you'll finally be able to beat the game, which certainly would have helped give you your money's worth back in the day. While I can't really say that I would have been rushing out to buy the game as soon as it came out, it definitely would have been worth a weekend rental or two. Developed by Sega, Mystic Defender was based on a manga and anime series in Japan, and was the sequel to a Sega Master System game called Spellcaster. In this game, you take on the role of Joe Yamato, a sorcerer who is called upon to save some chick named Alexandria, who is not Joe's girlfriend, but was kidnapped by the evil sorcerer Zareth. The game is an action platformer that reminds me a lot of Magician Lord on the Neo Geo. Joe has no physical weapons and relies only on his magical powers, starting off the game with a single spell. As the game progresses, you pick up additional offensive spells and can switch between them as needed. You can either tap the attack button to release a normal shot, or hold it down to charge up a more powerful one. You also pick up both red and blue orbs. The red ones allow you to charge your shot faster, and the blue ones replenish 1 bar of your health. The graphics look good for an early Genesis title, especially in the later levels, and the game has a crazy amount of parallax scrolling in the background. The soundtrack features a number of catchy tunes, and was written by the same woman who scored Alex Kidd in the Enchanted Castle. While this game is definitely not in the top tier of action platformers on the Genesis, it's worth a look if you're a fan of the genre looking for something new to play. For the same reason, I couldn't see myself buying this game back in the day, but once again would have been worth a weekend rental or two, and is worth picking up now if the price is right. Zoom was developed by Discovery Software, and is based on the 1988 Amiga game of the same name. I've been aware of this game by name only for a long time, but the first time I ever actually played it was for this episode. Based purely on the box art, I had chalked it up as a generic platform game, but it's actually an action puzzler similar in execution to Pac-Man or Clu-Clu Land. The gameplay revolves around you circumnavigating every square on a grid while avoiding various enemies and stationary traps. You can jump over enemies, which of course means that you're no longer tracing a path while airborne, or you can throw balls behind you, which knock enemies back but don't kill them. You can also pick up power-ups that make you invincible, make enemies move more slowly, or freeze them in place, or even end the level immediately. Audio-visually, the game doesn't have a whole lot going for it. The graphics can best be described as fine, and the music and sound effects are adequate. I want to like this game a lot more than I actually do, but I also like it a lot more than I expected to when I first played it, so take that however you like. Definitely not a game that I would have bought back in the day. This game seems more like something that your well-intentioned sweet old grandma would buy you for Christmas. Thanks, Grandma. The Revenge of Shinobi came out in either very late December or first thing in January of 1990. Either way, it makes an excellent bookend for this episode. The game was released in Japan as the Super Shinobi, was the sequel to the 1987 Sega System 16 arcade hit Shinobi, and was specifically developed for the Mega Drive and Genesis. The development of this game was directed by Noriyoshi Oba, who also directed the Streets of Rage series, which may explain not only the sharing of sound effects between the games, but the composer as well. The Revenge of Shinobi was the first Mega Drive game scored by Yuzo Koshiro, who would later go on to write the soundtracks for all 3 Streets of Rage games, and who still writes video game soundtracks to this day. As one might expect, the soundtrack doesn't disappoint. In fact, along with the music from the Sonic the Hedgehog and Streets of Rage series, this is among my favorite music on the Genesis. In this side-scrolling action game, you take on the role of Joe Musashi, who is out to both avenge the killing of his sensei and, of course, rescue his kidnapped wife. Your primary weapon is the shuriken, which you have a limited number of, but with ample opportunity to replenish your stock. You also carry a sword, which you automatically use in close-quarters situations. Performing a double jump causes you to do a mid-air somersault, during which you can fire off an 8 shuriken spread shot, which is costly but certainly comes in handy. There are actually 4 ROM revisions of this game due to the use of copyrighted characters in early revisions, including Rambo, Spider-Man, and the Terminator. The earliest version of this game is the most collectible because it's the most uncommon, but aside from changes in some of the sprites, all revisions of the game play identically. The difficulty level in this game ramps up quickly, and in fact I was only able to make it to the 3rd stage while recording the gameplay for this episode. That being said, this is the kind of game that will always keep you wanting to come back for more, as it manages to keep the challenge high but the frustration fairly low. The Revenge of Shinobi is a game that would have been absolutely worth blowing your Christmas cash on when it came out, just as it's more than worth its asking price today. That's going to do it for this episode of Classic Gaming Quarterly. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.